So who was he, this man, Francis, who could speak to animals and who could tame fierce wolves? Well, he was born in the year of our Lord 1181 in the little town of Assisi, whose cobbled streets and churches perched on the slopes of Mount Sebastian looked out over the great plains beyond. And he was born into a wealthy family. His father was Pietro de Bernardone, a cloth merchant, a powerful man in town, not somebody to be trifled with. And his mother was the Lady Pica, and she was French. And as a baby in the cradle, she would sing him troubadour love songs from her homeland. When the day of the christening arrived, Pietro de Bernardone was away on business, and his mother, with some intuition that he would become a holy man, called him Giovanni, after one of the apostles. But when Pietro de Bernardone returned home, he was furious. He had given no assent to this. He wanted his son to become a businessman, not a holy man. And he couldn't undo the christening. But nevertheless, and because he appears to have been obsessed with all things French, married a French woman, often went to France on business. And because of this, he called his son Francesco, which literally means Frenchman. It may sound strange, but the name stuck. And Francis was a sickly child, often ill, but he had a strong spirit that often had him out with his friends, and they would ride imaginary horses. They would wave wooden swords in the air and dream of the day when they would be knights and ride into battle. For the knights were the heroes of this age. Time passed, and he was a man at 15. And he spent his days working in his father's business in the shop, which was full of shelves stacked with cloths and linens and silks of many colours and smells from all parts of the world. And he was a good salesman. He loved talking to people. He liked closing a good deal. And his father gave him a generous allowance. And at night, he spent it in the tavernas, the inns of Assisi with his friends, drinking, gambling, eating, doing everything to excess. And he was popular. He was the life and soul of the party because he had this joyful spirit in him that everyone wanted to be around, everyone wanted to feel. And because he was so generous with his father's money, he could always be relied upon for another round, Francis, another round. And late in the evening, it would be Francis often who would lead the farandole, a riotous, reeling, drunken, merry dance through the cobbled streets of Assisi, much to the annoyance of anyone who was trying to get a good night's sleep. And even later in the evening, he might have been found beneath the windows of the most beautiful women in town, singing those troubadour love songs from his homeland, or from his mother's homeland. Years passed, and he was 20 years old when he and his friends, their dream of being knights, came to fruition. For at that time, Italy was divided into lots of city-states, and they were always quarrelling and warring with one another. And the neighbouring town of Perugia declared war on Assisi, and the army was made ready. And Francis found himself one morning seated on a fine horse, chainmail around his body, sword at his side, the flag of Assisi fluttering in the breeze, and the excitement of all of his friends around him. And the city gates were thrown open, and they all rode out to war. A battle took place a few miles distant on a hillside called Collestrada. It wasn't so much a battle as a rout, for the army of Perugia was bigger and better led, and the army of Assisi was crushed. And Francis was introduced to the true horror of war. And he saw many of his friends killed. And he himself was put in chains and dragged off to a dungeon in Perugia. And he found himself chained to a wall, with his comrades chained beside him, in a dark, dank dungeon, the only light coming from a grill on the city street above. And the only sounds were the drip, drip of water, the scuttling and squeaking of rats, and the moaning of the wounded. Days passed, weeks. Sometimes they heard the young men of Perugia partying on the streets above, as they had done in their own city only a few months before. Francis didn't know if or when he would ever be released. And disease spread its ugly tendrils. And he caught both tuberculosis and malaria, with its bone-racking fevers. And Francis suffered. But in that suffering, in that dark place, he discovered something. That bubbling spring of joy that had got him out playing at nights with his friends as a young boy and partying in the tavernas as a young man, it was still there inside of him, bubbling up from his immortal soul. And sometimes it was so strong inside of him that he couldn't contain it, and he would burst into song, and those prison walls would echo with those troubadour love songs, inspiring some prisoners and annoying others. Oh, Francis, shut up! He, in that moment, in that place, had discovered perfect happiness.